Welcome to Perfection's Clutch Installation Lab. Today we've got a 2003 Kia Rio, about 111,000 miles. Now this vehicle, when you push on the clutch pedal, you get a lot of creaking noises coming from the release system. And the pedal feels a little rough. It's not as smooth as it should be. Three likely sources of this noise. The cable itself, that's the primary source. The clutch release fork, where it pivots and where it contacts anything. And third would be the clutch release bearing as it slides onto the front of the transmission. So we're going to take a close look at detailing this release system and the clutch on this 2003 Kia Rio. All right, Tim, go ahead and push the clutch pedal. The transmission has been removed, but before we remove the clutch, you want to take a look at it and see if there's any reasons for the replacement. For example, contamination from oil or coolant. If there's anything broken that you can see right now. All I can see right now is some advanced wear on the spring tips, but again, 111,000 miles, and possibly we need to check with the owner and see if they kept up with the adjustment on the cable. This is a standard manual adjusting cable system. There's the threads right there. Need to make sure they understand that. So we're going to go ahead and take the clutch off, take a look at the disc, the flywheel, and get started putting this one back together. So here's the transmission just after we removed it. That's the position for the release of the clutch when you push the pedal down. And back here would be engage when we're driving. So release, engage, release, engage. Now I don't feel anything right now in my hands just by working it. We're going to take this apart, make sure we clean the fork, service the bushings, clean underneath the clutch release bearing where it slides, and in particular, I want to clean up the input shaft real good because there's some corrosion, fretting corrosion. When the disc just slides a little bit on there, moves back and forth, after time it builds up some rust. That rust prevents the disc from sliding freely. We want to make sure it slides free, and we'll also clean up the area where the pilot bearing rides. Now we put a small pack of spline lubricant in each of our kits. I'm going to go ahead and open that up and just squirt the grease. If you don't happen to have one of these grease packs, any type of good high temperature wheel bearing grease. Spread the grease around. Then you can take the pack if you like and just use that to kind of distribute the grease on there. And notice by using the pack, I didn't get my hands dirty. Now, always with clean hands, take the clutch disc, slide it on, slide it off, index it, slide it on, slide it off. All you're doing is distributing that grease. The purpose of the grease is to help prevent corrosion from building up on the input shaft with time. Allows the disc to slide freely. Then wipe up any excess grease, and you're all set. The flywheel's been resurfaced. It had a 20,000th of an inch positive step, so this was higher than this. The machinist took care of that. Now, one other unusual thing about this Kia Rio, these bolts for the flywheel go all the way through into the oil area. So oil can get on those bolt threads and actually wick their way across the threads, get up here and potentially contaminate our clutch. So the manufacturer recommends to use a stud and bearing mount sealant on there. So we apply that to the threads, get those started. Now to prevent the flywheel from turning, I've just used a piece of some kind of channel. I've bolted it to the flywheel and put in one of the heavier bolts to the engine, and that's going to prevent the flywheel from turning. So let me get started tightening this, and it'll be a two-step torque process. Now I'm just going to use my ratchet and go around in a staggered pattern, snug the bolts up. Now this is where having the flywheel secure like this really helps out. I'm only going to go to about half of the torque on this. It's 75 pound-feet, so I've set my wrench for 35. I'm going to go ahead and do the initial tightening in a staggered pattern. Now with the torque wrench set to 75, give them the final tightening. One, two, three, four, 5, 6. Buddy, answer the phone. Somebody's computer needs fixing. Torqued, checked, ready to install the clutch. But first I got to do some cleaning. Now it's time to clean the flywheel. We just need to clean the friction surface where the clutch disc is going to ride. A little bit of brake clean type product or rubbing alcohol. Clean that surface off real good. Now this is the only surface of the pressure plate we need to clean is right here. The friction surface where the clutch disc touches. Clean spot of towel, some more brake clean, or rubbing alcohol. There we go. No part of the clutch disc needs to be clean. Notice I'm not even touching with my hands. I'm using the plastic bag. I want to keep that nice and clean. You can also see I already put the pilot bearing in while I had the flywheel on the bench. Just use a small press, or you could carefully put a driver up there, or sometimes we'll use a socket. Don't hit the center of the bearing. Just tap it here on the outer edge, the outside race. Tap it in this case it's flush. There's a little recess on the crank that the bearing sits in. Now one thing we always want to check when we install a clutch is the orientation. There definitely always is a flywheel side or an engine side or transmission side designation of some kind. If you're not sure, give us a call. So we've got the flywheel side. That's going to go like this. So this side is going to go in the pressure plate assembly. Take the whole assembly and we'll put it up on the dowel pins. Take the alignment tool, pick up the disc, find our pilot, hold it, and start a couple of bolts. Now I've only put in 3 bolts right now and just finger tight. But I want to start to feel the alignment tool and make sure that the disc is centered nicely over the pilot bearing. So as I push the alignment tool in, I'm in the teeth. In this case, I don't even feel it pick up the pilot bearing. You can push in, wiggle it around, make sure that you feel that it's centered up correctly before you start to tighten it up at all. If it's off a little bit, you're going to have a difficult day. And we've seen the results of those difficult days when that transmission is out of position, and people tend to get a little creative over how they put the transmission in. Nice fit. Now I'm not using any thread locking compound on these bolts because these have lock washers. Now we'll start a staggered pattern, crisscross pattern, but we're not going to use an impact wrench. No air tools. Half, 3/4 turn, staggered pattern, crisscross. You don't want to distort the clutch cover, the stamping, as you're pulling the bolts down. Now the KIA specification is 13 to 20 pound-feet. I've got the wrench set for 17. They've already been pulled down once. We're just going to give them the final torque check here. The disc is correctly centered, just a light coating of grease. Pressure plate and flywheel were both clean with brake clean or rubbing alcohol prior to installation. Kept the disc free from contamination. Bolts were pulled down in a staggered pattern and then finally torqued to about 17 pound-feet of torque. It's transmission time. Two small details to help make it easier to get the transaxle in place. I'm going to put a little bit of grease around the dowel sleeves on both sides of the engine and in the hole that the dowel sleeve slides into. That just helps lubricate the transaxle case as it goes up against the sleeve. No sense fighting it. Next, I went to the hardware store with one of the bolts, and I got another bolt that's metric, thread pitch matches. We cut the head off, used a hacksaw, put a screwdriver slot in there. We're going to install these in two holes on the back of the engine as guide pins for the transaxles that comes up in there. I've got one up here, and I've got one down here. The idea is, as you're putting the transmission up there, it gets kind of hard to see everything. These will reach into the transaxle case and help guide it in place. Varies from vehicle to vehicle whether this will be helpful. It depends how much room you have, so it's just an idea you could try when you install your next transmission or transaxle. Now for the clutch release bearing, KIA specifies that you grease the grease groove inside there and the two spots where the fork touches the back of the bearing. So I'm going to take the fork, put those contact points up against the bearing, slide the entire assembly on, get it in position, bring the actuator arm down, pick up the bushings, and insert the bolt that locks the actuator arm shaft onto the fork. So I'll get a wrench and tighten that up, clean up that little bit of extra grease. We'll be all set. The new clutch is installed. The cross shaft and fork have been serviced, the release bearing. So this is the old cable. Tim, go ahead and push the clutch pedal. Thank you, Tim. Now, if I was a betting man, I would have said it was the cable. We actually went out and bought a cable. We're going to install that next. So this was quite a surprise. If this would have been in my shop, I probably would have replaced the cable first, thinking that was the most likely cause. But it was not the cable. We've done nothing to the cable so far. But those bushings were dry. The bearing where it slides on the transmission was dry. Tim, one more time. And how's it feel, Tim? Tim says it feels good. So we're going to go ahead and put the cable on and then wrap this up. The new clutch cable is installed. Tim, go ahead and push on the clutch pedal. Nice and quiet and smooth. So we'll put the rest of the car back together and take it out for a test drive. Well, I just came back from a test drive and the clutch and the release system were both very smooth. I think the owner of the car will be very pleased with how this turned out. I think it's very, very important that we look at the release system of whatever vehicle we're working on to make sure there are no problems with it. This one was a bit of a fooler. I think we would have been a little bit better off if we'd known what parts were inside that transaxle. I didn't know it had a cross shaft going to a fork. I didn't know there were two bushings supporting it when we started the teardown process. If we'd have known that, I might have made a better guess about where the potential problem was. Please look at the release system. If it's sending a bad signal to the clutch release bearing, that signal goes through the clutch and we don't get the correct clutch action that we should have. A manual transmission and clutch should be fun to drive. That's why I drive them. I enjoy changing gears myself. If you have any questions about a clutch, a release system, didn't get any .3 in my hands this time, or a flywheel, please call 800-258-8312, press 4. Your call will go direct to Tony, Steve, Bobby, or myself. We'll be glad to take your call and help you out.